The big story this week is about the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran, even as the U.S. military continues a large buildup of both offensive and defensive capabilities. President Trump has said he's given the Iranians a deadline for reaching an agreement. Hamas is enthusiastically accepting those parts of the Gaza Strip ceasefire plan they like and refusing the parts they don't. Israel's economy continues to be wobbly, with plenty of good and bad news, while Aliyah continues to increase. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Well, friends, shalom. And for the third week in a row, the big news is about something that hasn't even happened yet. And I am, of course, talking about the U.S. military strike on Iran. Every night before we go to sleep, we arrange our shoes neatly next to the door in case we have to run to the bomb shelter because the war has started and the Iranian missiles are coming our way. But every morning we wake up and it hasn't happened yet. A member of the VFI News team told me a story this week about the birth of his oldest child and how his wife was in the hospital for 10 days, can you believe it? Because the doctors believed she could give birth literally at any moment. But on the 10th day, something changed, and the doctors told her to go home, so she did. But less than an hour after arriving home, she went into labor, and they had to get an ambulance to bring her back to the hospital, where she gave birth just a few minutes after they rolled her into the delivery ward. Now, as some of you know, in addition to being a news broadcaster, I am also one who likes to share about God's kingdom. And this story provides me with some great material for my next sermon. But it also gives me some insights to share with you about this current situation. Because although it's difficult to live in this tension of knowing that war with Iran could break out literally at any moment, we also know that we can't relax and pretend like there's nothing to worry about. The moment we do, the first time we neglect to arrange our shoes next to the door so we can run to the bomb safety shelter, that's the time the sirens will wake us up in the middle of the night. This is what we're dealing with in Israel, folks, so keep that in mind as we dive deeper into this report. Now, last Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was at the White House for an emergency consultation with President Trump about the situation. The meeting lasted almost 3 hours, much longer than what had been planned. And when it was over, President Trump merely said that he had insisted that negotiations continue. That's all he said, and Netanyahu didn't say anything. And it's very obvious that a 3-hour meeting with the President of the United States covers more than just an insistence that negotiations will continue. So we all have to try and figure out what might happen next. Some clues began to leak out as the days went by, including an announcement shortly after the meeting ended that the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier has been ordered to deploy to the Eastern Mediterranean. As a quick side note, Gerald Ford wasn't president for very long, but he did some positive things, and I'm glad he's being memorialized by having a major warship named after him. I wouldn't mind one after me as well. Well, that having been said, this ship that bears his name set sail on its current deployment in June of last year. So by the time it arrives in the Eastern Mediterranean, putting it within striking distance of Iran, the crew will have been out to sea for almost 9 months. That's a long time for these people to be away from home, even if they're not fighting a war. If the war starts, they'll be under added strain, and so with their ships and aircraft, which means an already difficult and expensive battle will get even harder, more dangerous, and more expensive. Now, on that last note, this deployment of military assets to the Middle East has already cost the American taxpayers a very substantial amount of money. And that's one more factor weighing on the minds of President Trump and his advisors. Having spent so much on this, they'll be under tremendous pressure from Congress to be able to show that they got something for it. That means either a very good agreement or a very effective strike that probably won't be deemed to have been sufficient until the regime falls. On that note, many analysts, as well as the president's closest allies in Congress, have pointed out that if he doesn't strike Iran after all this, it could be a devastating blow to America's global standing. Now that last part might sound a little bit cynical, my friends, but this is the background to the story we're covering. As I said before, some more details about the meeting at the White House leaked out over the last few days, and they give us even more background. For instance, Netanyahu reportedly told President Trump that even if he gets a deal with the Ayatollah regime to reduce activity in the nuclear program, they won't honor any such agreement. And Trump responded that he knew that was probably true, but he thought it was worth giving the negotiations more time to see if something positive might come out of it. On Tuesday, another interesting announcement was made as the U.S. Air Force awarded the Boeing Corporation a contract to manufacture several of the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator bombs to replace the ones that were dropped on Iran's nuclear sites last June. Now, I'm going to switch briefly to commentary mode because a moment ago we talked about the Gerald Ford, but there's another former U.S. president who comes to my mind here, and that's Theodore Roosevelt. He was president from 1900 to 1909, and he was famous for saying America should speak softly and carry a big stick. Now, I don't know if President Trump is a big fan of Roosevelt, but in this situation, he seems to be pursuing his policy. He's not making a lot of fiery speeches and making threats like the officials of the Ayatollah regime are doing to an almost comically hysterical degree. On the contrary, he's making seemingly off-the-cuff comments about how it would be the best thing for everyone if the regime were to fall, as well as saying very straightforwardly that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei needs to be very worried. However, the actions he's taken clearly adds to brandishing a big shtick or a stick, and he's not the only one doing something like that. Around 250,000 people were in the streets of Munich over this last weekend to voice their own support for the overthrow of the Ayatollah regime. Bravo to all of you in Munich. The demonstration, meant to take advantage of the large number of world leaders assembled for the annual Munich Security Conference, featured a speech by Crown Prince of Iran's Pahlavi dynasty, who has led the Iranian diaspora resistance to the Ayatollah regime. He told the crowd that now is the time for demonstrations inside Iran to continue and for the regime to be overthrown. It can be assumed that he would not make such a public statement if he did not believe that the American military action against the regime is more likely than not. There's one more big factor, almost an elephant in the room at this point, and that's the massacre of protesters the regime carried out just a few short weeks ago. The regime has continued to hunt down and imprison its domestic opponents, and there are also grisly reports of torture and summary executions in Iran's prisons over the last several weeks. Despite, or maybe because of this, Reva Pahlavi told his supporters in Munich last weekend that the protests should continue and even escalate until they had succeeded in overthrowing the regime. This week, there were some reports of renewed protests, including people shouting anti-regime slogans from the windows of their homes in many Iranian cities. So the people are still ready to push back against the regime despite the violence they've already endured and the fears they must have of what could happen to them if they continue. I am personally quite moved by this and believe it provides even more of a moral justification for a U.S. strike on the regime in case anyone in Washington still thinks that kind of stuff still matters. Once again, sorry for sounding cynical, but it's very hard to avoid that when you've lived as long as I have. Speaking of cynicism, the Iranian regime just can't seem to stop being its own worst enemy. Regime officials keep on repeating their maximalist positions, not giving an inch, holding on to their pride, their threats, their lies, their arrogance, their deception. You know what I'm talking about. For domestic consumption, they have projected a narrative that they're in control of the situation, that no one is going to dictate anything to them, that they won't be intimidated or threatened into giving up their rights as they define them. In particular, They have been adamant that their ballistic missile arsenal is not up for discussion, nor is their support for regional proxy groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen. Above all, they continue to scornfully reject any and all censure or even commentary by anyone else, even the UN, regarding the brutal and bloody crackdown that they carried out against protesters in January. They continue to insist that these are all internal Iranian issues that no one else has any business even being interested in, much less trying to tell them what to do about any of it. So once again, we're all keeping our shoes neatly arranged next to the door as we go to bed at night here in Israel. The possibility of war is high, and the people who might be able to stop it don't seem to be willing to swallow their pride and do what has to be done to make it not happen. Once again, I'll say what I've said elsewhere, that President Trump is unlikely to start a war before the end of the Olympics, which will be on the 22nd of February. However, also, the Muslim holy month of Ramadan started this week on the 17th of February. Many people believe that it would be unwise for the United States to start a war that could seriously disrupt the entire Middle East during this month, while others, including in the Iranian opposition, say it shouldn't be a consideration. Now, another big question hanging over everything that's going on regarding Iran is what will Iran's proxies do if the United States hits the Ayatollahs? If that happens, Israel could be exposed to some danger. So it's a problem we have to take in seriously. So going in order from the least likely to affect Israel to the most likely, we'll start with a statement the Taliban in Afghanistan made this week that they might come to Iran's aid if they are hit. Really? Candidly, I don't think they've got much capability to intervene in such a conflict, but it's worth mentioning them just for the record. Next, the Hashd al-Shaabi Shiite militias in Iraq, which also don't have much they can do to attack Israel on their Iranian patrons' behalf, but they could cause some problems for U.S. forces based in Iraq, Syria, and possibly elsewhere in the region. Then there's Hamas in Gaza, which is already causing problems for Israel, including by refusing to disarm despite the fact that we've theoretically reached Phase B of the Trump ceasefire plan, which includes them disarming. It also includes them handing over civil administration in the Gaza Strip to a team of technocrats from the Palestinian Authority and elsewhere. They are surprisingly willing to do that, but unsurprisingly, they're also trying to push thousands of their own fighters into the ranks of the civilian police forces who are supposed to be keeping order on the streets of Gaza under this plan. This is a transparent and deeply cynical way for them to keep their fighters armed, in shape, and being paid by someone else so they'll be ready for the time and place when Hamas decides to renew hostilities against Israel. In other words, they're trying to find a way to go back to business as usual, as if the last 2 years in which they've been clobbered by the IDF in retaliation for their own brutal massacre of Israelis on October 7, 2023, never happened. But it did happen, and Hamas must not be allowed to go back to business as usual. And by the way, any of you who think it was a conspiracy theory that October 7th never happened, you're deadly wrong. Well, next we need to talk about the Houthis in Yemen. They can disrupt international shipping through the Bab al-Mandab Straits and fire ballistic missiles at Israel. However, the IDF is warning that they might also be trying to fly fighters up from Yemen to Jordan so they'll be ready to take part in a ground invasion of Israel, which is being planned by other Iranian-backed terrorist groups in the region. This is a serious issue, and I have no doubt that the very capable security forces in Jordan are aware of it and are dealing with this matter, because they know that if this were to happen, the Hashemite kingdom would be deeply destabilized, and they don't want that to happen. However, this brings us to the next big problem, and that's all the Iranian-sponsored terrorist groups and criminal gangs which are trying to build up strength in Judea and Samaria, known to much of the world as the West Bank. The IDF border police, Shin Bet, and even the Palestinian Authority police have been working hard over the last 2 years or so to push back against this threat. Hundreds of terrorist suspects have been arrested, and massive quantities of weapons and ammunition have been confiscated. However, this threat to Israel's eastern flank remains, and it isn't going away anytime soon. That brings us to the threats on our northern border, including Hezbollah and Lebanon, and to a lesser extent, unfriendly elements in the territory of what we call Syria, for lack of a better term. The country you see on the map, which bears that name, is far from being a cohesive nation-state, but we can still use the term to describe the geographic area that is slowly becoming more cohesive under the administration of the al-Jolani regime in Damascus. This is both good news and bad news for Israel and everyone else, but we'll leave that story for another time. For now, it's enough to say that the IDF remains deployed in a buffer zone which extends from the Golan Heights almost to the southern outskirts of Damascus in order to prevent a spillover of problems from Syria into Israel. Next door in Lebanon, Hezbollah is stubbornly refusing to submit itself to the authority of the internationally recognized government, demanding the right to hold on to its large arsenals of rockets, missiles, drones, and other weapons. The Lebanese National Army has managed, against everyone's expectations, to mostly expel Hezbollah from the area south of the Litani River and adjacent to the Israeli border. They've also destroyed a fair amount of Hezbollah's attack tunnels and other preps for threatening the border. But north of the Litani, Hezbollah retains a diminished yet still substantial arsenal of longer-range rockets that it can fire into Israel, meaning we can't take our eyes off them. Now, the national security news took up most of our time this week's report, and rightfully so. But there's more going on in Israel than preparations for the next round of conflict. There's also an ongoing economic situation which includes a mix of good and bad news for big companies, small companies, nonprofits like Vision for Israel, municipalities, households, and individuals. To start off with, this past week has seen news of layoffs at some of Israel's biggest high-tech companies. That's right, high-tech. These are jobs that every Israeli parent hopes their children grow up to take on so they can support us in our old age. They are also the jobs that support many other jobs because the salaries that they pay make it possible for the people who earn them to buy nice homes and fill them with all kinds of neat stuff from the local mall, eating at fancy restaurants, but these high-paying jobs are not as plentiful as they used to be. And that's a trend that's set to continue not only here in Israel but around the world. It's back to hummus, my friends. Now, there are many other sectors of Israel's economy that continue to be very shaky, most notably the tourism industry, which I mentioned last week as accounting for a very large percentage of the jobs in Israel. Thousands of people work in national parks, in gift shops, and hotels, restaurants, guides, bus drivers, etc. But in recent years, for obvious reasons, there haven't been many tourists coming to Israel. There was a noticeable rebound in 2025, and so far in 2026, the numbers are very encouraging. But of course, if there's a new war with Iran that lasts for several weeks or even longer, the numbers will probably go back down, airlines will cancel flights, and tourism will stay down for a long time. Now, on the other hand, the world's demand for natural gas just seems to keep increasing, and Israel has managed to build a very large and robust production and export capacity for the reserves of natural gas that were discovered off our coast in the past few decades. This has led to a continued flow of capital into the country and tax revenues into the treasury. But this is not a long-term solution, friends, unless you're in the whole universal guaranteed income shtick, which I have very mixed feelings about. Friends, we're coming close to the end of this week's report, so I'll just briefly go over some of the other big stories making headlines in Israel this week, if you don't mind. To start with, we're watching with horror as antisemitism continues to blossom all over the world, including in many countries where we never thought we'd see it. For instance, during an official state visit this past week to Australia, Israeli President Isaac Herzog was harassed by anti-Zionist protests everywhere he went, including Sydney, where he had been invited to participate in memorial services for the victims of the Bondi Beach Hanukkah massacre. To briefly switch to commentary mode if anyone tries to tell you that this is all about Benjamin Netanyahu and the government, or even the Israeli government policy, the proof that none of that is true was clearly on display in this visit. President Herzog doesn't make Israeli government policy, nor is he part of the Netanyahu coalition in the Knesset. His only crime is that he is an official representative of a Jewish state called Israel, which reminds people of a book called the Bible, and a God that is described prescribed, who keeps his promises to bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse it. He also sets rules for human conduct and behavior, which he has authority to set because he has created this universe and everything in it. In this book called the Bible, he tells us what the blessings are for obeying him, and he also tells us what the consequences are for disobeying him. People in today's world don't want to be reminded of all that, so they lash out at anything that reminds them of it, especially Israel and the Jews, but also including Bible-believing Christians. None of this should surprise us because it was all prophesied about it all a long time ago. Now, on that note, we've come to the end of this week's report, so I'll continue the tradition of ending with some good news by telling you that there's a silver lining to this upsurge of anti-Semitism in the world. The silver lining is that it is motivating an ever-increasing number of Jewish people to seriously consider immigrating to Israel, also known as making Aliyah, which means to go up. As an anecdotal point, I can tell you that English has always been commonly spoken in Jerusalem, but in the past few years it's becoming almost as common to hear in Beersheba, Haifa, and other large cities. I also hear almost as much French being spoken on the streets of Netanya and in Jerusalem these days as English. Needless to say, Russian has long been the most commonly spoken language in Israel, other than Hebrew, Arabic, and English, of course. And the surge in Aliyah that all this indicates was also prophesied about a long time ago, including in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 22, which says, "Behold, I will lift my hand in an oath to the nations and set up my standard for the peoples. They shall bring your sons in their arms, and your daughters shall be carried on their shoulders." Well, friends, that's a prophecy about Gentile Christians helping the Jewish people come home. And if you want to be part of fulfilling that prophecy, you can visit visionforisrael.com to find out how you can be part of that and partner with us. With that, I'm Barry Siegel, and this has been another edition, I'm glad to say, of VFI News from Israel.